I don't know how to explain it, but when you lose someone close to you, especially a parent, there's this emptiness inside that's hard to describe. After my dad passed, that emptiness didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. His death had been sudden, unexpected. A heart attack while he was out in the yard, raking leaves like any other ordinary day. One minute he was there, and the next, gone. For months, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I mean, death is always hard to accept, but this was different. It was as if there were loose ends, like my dad was still trying to tell me something. I know it sounds crazy, but the feeling lingered. And the dreams, God, the dreams were relentless. They started about a week after the funeral. In every dream, I was standing in the middle of this vast fog-covered landscape, surrounded by rows and rows of coffins. They stretched out as far as I could see, like some macabre ocean made of wood and metal. And I was always looking for something, though I wasn't sure what at first. But after a while, I knew. I was searching for my dad's coffin. The thing is, I wasn't alone in these dreams. There was this presence, something unseen but undeniably there, always watching me. Sometimes I could hear it, whispers, faint and unintelligible, carried on the wind. They would grow louder the closer I got to a coffin, urging me to open it, to look inside. But no matter how many I opened, none of them held my dad. The presence, whatever it was, felt like it was toying with me, leading me down a path that had no end. I tried to ignore the dreams at first, chalking them up to grief, stress, all the usual things people go through after losing someone, but they wouldn't stop. Night after night, the same scene, me standing in that eerie sea of coffins, searching, always searching. It started bleeding into my waking life. I'd catch myself thinking about it during the day, obsessing over the idea that my dad's coffin wasn't where it was supposed to be, that something had gone wrong. I knew it sounded ridiculous. His funeral had been simple, dignified. His coffin had been lowered into the ground like it was supposed to be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to find him. That's how I ended up where I did. One night, after another restless sleep filled with those endless coffins, I decided to visit the cemetery. It wasn't something I planned. It was more like a compulsion, something I needed to do. It was late, well past midnight, and the cemetery was closed, but I didn't care. I drove there anyway, my head buzzing with the irrational certainty that I had to go. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. The gates were locked, but I found a way in, slipping through a gap in the iron fence. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be for that time of year, and the fog that had settled over the graves made everything look distorted, almost unreal. I walked through the rows of headstones, my breath coming out in shallow puffs, each step crunching softly on the gravel paths. The farther I went, the more surreal everything became. The headstones seemed to shift in the fog, their shapes warping, stretching, like they were barely holding themselves together. And then I saw it, a row of coffins, not buried, but just there, sitting on the ground as if they'd been left out in the open, exposed. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at them. It didn't make any sense. Coffins don't just get left out like that, but in that moment, logic didn't matter. It felt like I had stepped straight into my dreams, like the boundary between reality and whatever haunted my sleep had dissolved. I started walking toward the coffins, my legs moving on their own, driven by that same unseen force that had been pulling at me in my dreams. There were dozens of them, maybe more, each one identical to the next. Dark wood, simple designs, nothing to distinguish one from another. But as I got closer, I could feel something. A pull. Like one of them was calling to me. I reached out, my hand trembling as it brushed against the cold wood of the nearest coffin. The moment my fingers touched it, I felt something, an energy almost like a pulse running through the coffin and into my skin. It was subtle at first, but then it intensified, a tingling sensation that shot up my arm and into my chest. It wasn't painful, but it was unsettling, like I was tapping into something I wasn't supposed to. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but that feeling only grew stronger. It was as if the coffin was alive in some way, responding to my touch. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back and leave this place, but I couldn't. I had to open it. I had to know. With shaking hands, I gripped the edge of the lid and slowly lifted it. The creak of the wood echoed in the silence, louder than it should have been. Inside, the coffin was empty. Nothing but darkness and the faint scent of damp earth. But I knew that wasn't right. I felt something there, even if I couldn't see it. I moved on to the next coffin, and the one after that, repeating the same process, each time feeling that strange, invisible pull guiding me. Each one felt the same, alive in a way, but empty. The whispers were louder now, swirling around me, urging me to keep going. And then I reached it. I didn't even have to open it to know. This one was my father's. I could feel it in my bones. The pull was so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet. I reached for the lid, my hands shaking uncontrollably now. I was terrified, more terrified than I'd ever been in my life, but I couldn't stop myself. As the lid creaked open, the air around me seemed to thicken, growing colder, denser. My breath caught in my throat as I stared down into the coffin. It wasn't empty. Lying inside, in the same suit we'd buried him in, was my father. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, as if he were just sleeping. But there was something wrong. His skin, it was too pale, almost translucent, and his hands were folded over his chest in a way that seemed unnatural. I reached out, not really knowing what I was doing, and touched his hand. The moment I made contact, I felt it again, that pulse, that energy surging through me. But this time it was overwhelming. It slammed into me like a wave, and I stumbled back, gasping for air. And that's when his eyes opened. They snapped open so suddenly that I didn't even have time to scream. But they weren't my father's eyes. They were dark, bottomless, like twin voids staring straight through me. His hand twitched, and I scrambled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, stumbling through the fog, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still feel his eyes on me, watching, following, even though I knew he wasn't chasing me. He didn't have to. I made it out of the cemetery somehow, collapsing against the iron fence, my body trembling uncontrollably. The fog had lifted slightly, and for a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that it was just my grief twisting my mind into something unrecognizable. But when I looked back toward the graves, I saw it. His coffin, still open, the lid resting at an odd angle, and standing just behind it, half hidden in the shadows, was my father. Or whatever was my father. I don't go to the cemetery anymore. I don't sleep much either. The dreams haven't stopped. If anything, they're worse now. I still see the coffins stretching out in every direction, but now, every time I open one, he's there, waiting, and every night the pull gets stronger. I don't really know how to explain it or where to start, but if I don't talk about it, I'm afraid it'll never leave me alone. It's the kind of thing that gets under your skin, digs in deep, and stays with you, even when you think you've moved past it. It all started about 6 months ago, right after my family and I moved into our new house. It wasn't anything special, a simple 2-story place on a quiet street with a small backyard and just enough space for us to feel comfortable. My wife, Emily, and our daughter, Lily, were thrilled. It was supposed to be a fresh start for all of us, a new chapter. But from the very beginning, something felt off. At first, it was small things. I'd wake up in the middle of the night for no real reason. There'd be this strange silence, like the house itself was holding its breath. I'd hear these faint creaks coming from the hallway outside our bedroom, like footsteps but too light, too soft to belong to anyone. I told myself it was just the house settling, the usual sounds that come with any old building. But deep down, it felt like more than that. It felt like we weren't alone. Emily noticed it too. She didn't say much at first, but I could see it in her eyes. She'd walk into a room and hesitate, just for a second, like she was expecting something to be there. Sometimes she'd glance over her shoulder when she thought no one was looking. And then there was Lily. She was only 6, and at that age, kids are always full of imagination, right? But the things she said, they didn't feel like the harmless fantasies of a child. One night, about 2 weeks after we moved in, Lily came running into our room, crying. She told us there was a person standing at the foot of her bed. But when I checked her room, there was no one there. I figured it was just a nightmare, maybe stress from the move. But then she said something that made my skin crawl. They don't have a face, she whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. They just stand there, watching. I tried to comfort her, but her words stuck with me. No face. It was such a strange, specific detail. Over the next few weeks, Lily kept mentioning the person more often, usually at night when she was trying to fall asleep. Each time, she would describe the same thing: a tall figure, standing completely still and always without a face. I didn't want to scare her, but the more she talked about it, the more uneasy I felt. Something about it gnawed at me. I started staying up later, keeping an eye on things, but nothing ever happened when I was awake. The house was quiet, normal even. But I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching us, lurking just out of sight. Things escalated from there. Emily started complaining about feeling cold spots in the house, pockets of air that would drop in temperature for no reason, even though the heat was on. And it wasn't just a little chilly. It was bone-numbing cold. At first, I shrugged it off as bad insulation, but when I felt it for myself, this sudden, biting cold in the middle of an otherwise warm room, I knew something was wrong. One night, we were having dinner when the lights in the kitchen suddenly flickered. It wasn't like a power surge or anything. The lights would flicker once, twice, and then go completely dark for a few seconds. And in that darkness, there was this oppressive feeling, like the air was thick with something heavy. Then, just as suddenly, the lights would come back on. We all looked at each other, trying to laugh it off, but I could see the fear in Emily's eyes. And Lily, she wasn't laughing. She was staring at the doorway leading to the hall, her eyes wide. When I asked her what was wrong, she pointed toward the darkness. "They're watching us," she whispered. After that night, the feeling of being watched became constant. There were times I'd be sitting in the living room, reading or watching TV, and I'd get this sensation that someone was standing right behind me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. Emily finally suggested we do something about it. We weren't particularly religious, but after everything that had happened, we were willing to try anything. She reached out to a friend of hers who knew a local priest, someone who had experience with these kinds of things. I wasn't sure what to expect. I wasn't even sure if I believed in any of this supernatural stuff, but I was desperate to make it stop. The priest came over on a cold, gray afternoon. He was a quiet man, with kind eyes but a seriousness about him that made me uneasy. He walked through the house slowly, taking everything in. I remember the way his expression darkened as he moved through each room. When he got to Lily's bedroom, he stopped, just for a second, and made the sign of the cross. "We'll need to perform a cleansing," he said simply. The ritual itself was strange. He sprinkled holy water throughout the house, muttering prayers in Latin, while Emily and I stood nearby, feeling like spectators to something ancient and powerful. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the very air was resisting the cleansing. At one point, the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath, even though it was the middle of summer. And then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. The priest gave us a reassuring nod and told us that the spirit, whatever it was, should be gone. He left us with a final warning. Sometimes, the presence leaves a mark. You may feel it linger, but don't let it in. Keep your faith strong. For the first time in weeks, the house felt peaceful. That night, for the first time since we moved in, we all slept soundly. No strange noises, no flickering lights, no cold spots. It was like a weight had been lifted. We thought it was over. We thought we were safe, but we were wrong. About a week later, I started noticing small things I could easily dismiss at first. A chair slightly out of place, a door that I was sure I had closed left ajar. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was still on edge after everything that had happened. But then one evening, as I was sitting in the living room, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was alone. Emily had taken Lily to a friend's house for the afternoon. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles deep in your bones. I was flipping through channels on the TV when I heard it, a soft creak from the hallway. I froze, listening. Another creak, followed by the sound of something brushing against the wall. My heart started to race. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway, half expecting to see nothing. But then, I saw it, a figure. Tall, unnaturally tall, standing at the far end of the hall, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. It didn't move, it just stood there, completely still. And just like Lily had described, it had no face, just a smooth, blank expanse where its features should have been. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in place, staring at that thing. My mind was screaming at me to get up, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I think I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the driveway, gasping for air. I knew, right then and there, that it wasn't over. Whatever we had done with the ritual, it wasn't enough. The spirit hadn't left. It had just been waiting, watching, hiding in the shadows. Emily and I talked about leaving, about selling the house and moving far away. But something stopped us. It was like the house wouldn't let us go. Every time we tried to seriously discuss leaving, something strange would happen. A door would slam shut, the lights would flicker, or we'd hear footsteps upstairs. It was like the house itself was alive, trying to keep us there. And then, one night, it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Lily crying. I rushed to her room, my heart racing, and found her sitting up in bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. "They're in the house." I turned toward the door, and that's when I saw it, standing in the hallway, just outside Lily's room. The faceless figure. Only this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. 3, 4, maybe more. All standing there, silent, motionless, their blank faces turned toward us. I grabbed Lily, pulling her close, and backed away from the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could feel their presence, cold and oppressive, filling the room. And then, as if on cue, they all stepped forward. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Everything was a blur of panic and terror. I think I screamed for Emily, and we all ran, but I'm not sure. The only thing I know for certain is that we didn't stay in that house another night. We moved in with Emily's parents the next day. We never went back. But here's the thing. The priest was right about one thing. The presence, the mark, it's still with us. Even now, months later, I can still feel it. Sometimes late at night, I wake up with that same sense of dread, that feeling of being watched. And every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something. A shadow, a movement in the darkness, just for a second. It's still out there, it's still watching, and I don't think it's ever going to leave us alone. I remember that night like it just happened. My dad told me the story so many times when I was growing up that it feels like I was there with him. He swears to this day that it was real, and judging by the way he gets quiet whenever it comes up, I believe him. It all started when he and his friends decided to check out this old house they'd heard about, deep in the woods outside of town. You know how it is when you're young, right? You're always looking for something thrilling, some kind of adventure to get the adrenaline pumping. For them, it was this rumor about a house that was said to appear and disappear depending on the time of day, or the weather, or some other strange condition. People said that the house was haunted, and most of the locals avoided that part of the woods. But my dad and his buddies, well, they weren't the type to back down from a challenge. The night they decided to go was bitterly cold. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween, and the trees were practically bare, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. They took off after dusk, figuring it would be creepier that way, but also thinking it might give them a better chance of actually finding the place. They packed a couple of flashlights, an old compass, and, of course, some beers to loosen up the nerves. They hiked for what felt like hours, and my dad said it seemed like the deeper they went into the woods, the quieter everything got. No wind rustling the leaves, no animals scurrying around, nothing. Just silence. But then, out of nowhere, they stumbled across it. This hulking, decrepit mansion looming up between the trees. Dad said the place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were cracked or boarded up, and the roof sagged in a way that made it seem like the house was alive and breathing. The walls were covered in moss and vines, and the whole place seemed to radiate this deep, unnatural cold, colder than the night air around them. They should have turned back right then, but you know how guys are when they're in a group. None of them wanted to be the first to back out, so they pushed open the front door. The inside was worse than the outside. There was dust everywhere, thick enough to choke on, and the air smelled wrong, damp, like the place had been rotting from the inside out. Their flashlights flickered as they swept them over broken furniture, cobwebs stretching across the ceiling like nets, and old pictures on the walls whose faces were faded into smudges. But it was the silence that was the worst part. Not even the sound of their own footsteps seemed to echo. Now, my dad's a practical guy. He doesn't scare easy, but something about that house put him on edge from the second they walked in. And it didn't take long for things to get weird. They started exploring, moving from room to room, just trying to get a sense of the place. The floors creaked beneath their feet, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. Every now and then they'd find something odd. A broken mirror, a chair knocked over like someone had left in a hurry. But it wasn't until they found the staircase to the attic that things really took a turn. The attic door was halfway open, and it creaked when they nudged it, revealing a set of narrow, steep stairs. My dad and his friends figured if there was anything worth seeing in this place, it'd be up there. One by one, they climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under their weight. When they reached the attic, the air was even colder than the rest of the house, like walking into a freezer. The room was huge, stretching out under the sloping roof, but there wasn't much up there, at least not at first glance. Just a few pieces of furniture covered with old, dusty sheets and stacks of crates piled up against the walls. But then one of Dad's friends spotted something. In the far corner of the attic, almost hidden in the shadows, were chains. Thick, rusted chains bolted into the floor and the walls. Some of them had old locks on them, while others were just hanging loose, dragging across the floor like they had been broken. And the walls around them, they were scratched up. Deep, jagged marks dug into the wood, as if something or someone had been desperately trying to get free. That's when they heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, almost too quiet to notice, like footsteps coming from somewhere below them. But they were steady, growing louder with each passing second, climbing up the stairs one slow step at a time. My dad and his friends froze. They aimed their flashlights at the attic door, but it was still shut. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then started again, this time quicker, almost like someone or something was running up the stairs toward them. But when they threw open the attic door, the stairs were empty. No one was there. That's when the panic set in. They rushed down the stairs, their flashlights darting around, but every room they entered seemed different, wrong somehow. The hallway that led them in had vanished, and no matter which way they turned, they couldn't find the front door. They were trapped, wandering through rooms that twisted and folded in on themselves like a maze. And it got worse. No matter which direction they went, they always ended up back at the same place, the front entry hall. But the front door, it wasn't there anymore. The windows were all covered in thick black fog, like the outside world had just ceased to exist. The only thing they could hear was their own breathing, and those footsteps, sometimes loud, sometimes distant, but always there, just on the edge of their hearing, chasing them through the house. By now, they were panicking. The compass they brought with them? It was useless. The needle spun wildly, pointing in every direction at once, as if it didn't know where north was anymore. They tried breaking the windows, smashing the walls, but it was like the house wouldn't let them leave. And then suddenly everything stopped. The footsteps, the fog, the cold, it all vanished in an instant. My dad said it was like waking up from a nightmare. They looked around, and they were standing right outside the house, at the edge of the woods, as if they'd never gone inside. But when they turned to look back at the house, it was gone. Just trees and darkness where the mansion had been moments before. They never talked about it again after that night. Not to each other, not to anyone else. But whenever Dad tells the story, he swears that the house is still out there, somewhere in the woods, And sometimes when the wind blows just right, he says you can hear the faint echo of footsteps, following you, watching, waiting for someone else to find their way in. Dad always stopped the story there. He'd get this far-off look in his eyes, like he was seeing something none of us could. I'd press him for more details when I was younger, hungry for all the scary bits, but he'd just shake his head, muttering that some things were better left unsaid. But a couple of years ago, something changed. We were sitting around the fire pit one night, just me and him, the orange glow of the flames casting long shadows around the yard. I'd brought up the story again, half joking, asking him what he really thought happened in that house. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, and I thought that was it, that he wasn't going to say anything. But then, in a low voice, he started talking. "There's more," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never told you this part because, well, I didn't want you to think I was crazy. Hell, I didn't even want to believe it myself." I leaned in closer, the crackling of the fire the only sound around us. The air had grown still, and I could feel the tension building, like whatever he was about to say had been weighing on him for years. "When we got out of the woods that night," he continued, "we didn't just leave it behind. Something followed us." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't say anything. I just waited for him to go on. For weeks after we got out of there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started noticing little things. Objects in the house would move, doors would creak open by themselves, and at night I'd hear footsteps outside my window. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the whole experience had gotten under my skin, but deep down, I knew better. He paused, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to shake off a bad memory. It wasn't just me either. A couple of the guys I was with that night, they started acting strange too. One of them, Mike, he completely stopped hanging out with us. Wouldn't answer calls, wouldn't come out for beers, nothing. A few months later, he moved out of town without a word, just vanished. I tried to track him down, but no one knew where he'd gone. "Do you think something happened to him?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Dad nodded. "I don't know what, but yeah. He wasn't the same after that night. None of us were." He went quiet again, staring into the fire like he could see something in the flames. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, waiting for him to finish. "That wasn't the worst of it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A few weeks after Mike disappeared, I was home alone, late at night. Your mom had taken you to visit your grandparents, so I had the house to myself. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, trying to take my mind off everything, when I heard it." "Heard what?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling in my gut. "Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, coming down the hallway." I swallowed hard, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "What did you do?" At first I thought it was nothing. Maybe the house settling, or my mind playing tricks on me, but they kept getting louder, closer, until I could hear them right outside the living room door. Dad's voice shook, and for a second I thought he wasn't going to finish. But then he took a deep breath and pushed on. I got up, grabbed a bat from the closet, and slowly walked to the door. I was sure someone had broken in, but when I opened the door, he trailed off, his eyes wide, staring into the fire like he was seeing it all over again. There was no one there, just empty air, but the footsteps, they didn't stop. I could still hear them, moving past me, going deeper into the house. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I had to ask, "Did you follow them?" Dad nodded slowly. "I didn't want to, but I had to know." I followed the sound down the hallway, through the kitchen, and into the basement. The footsteps were so clear, like someone was walking just ahead of me, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't catch up. When I got to the basement, it was freezing down there, colder than it should have been, like the temperature had just dropped out of nowhere. He paused again, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. I could hear the footsteps circling around the room, getting closer and closer, but I couldn't see anything. Then, just as quickly as they started, they stopped, and that's when I saw it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't help but lean forward. "Saw what?" "The chains," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Rusty, old chains, just like the ones we saw in the attic of that house, hanging from the ceiling, swinging back and forth like something had just been there. And the walls, He swallowed hard. The walls were covered in scratches, deep, jagged marks, just like in the attic. I didn't know what to say. My dad, the man who never seemed scared of anything, looked genuinely shaken. "What did you do?" I finally managed to ask. "I ran," he admitted, his voice raw. "I ran out of that basement and out of the house, and I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street. After that, the footsteps stopped. The chains, I never saw them again, but I don't think it's over." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat tight. Dad looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. "I think the house is still out there, waiting. I don't know why, but I have this feeling that it's not done with us. Like it's just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to pull us back in." He didn't say anything else after that. We sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling softly between us. I could feel the weight of his words settling over me, like a cold shadow creeping up my spine. And now, every once in a while, when I'm alone in the house late at night, I'll hear it too. The faint sound of footsteps, moving slowly down the hallway, just out of sight. And I can't help but wonder if my dad was right. Maybe the house isn't done with us after all. I've never been a paranoid person. I grew up in a rough neighborhood with my dad, so I learned early on to keep my head down, mind my own business, and not let every little sound or strange occurrence get to me. You get used to certain things when you live in a place like that. Sirens in the distance, dogs barking through the night, the occasional shouting match from the neighbors. It just becomes part of the background noise. But this was different, and I'll never forget it. It started off small, nothing out of the ordinary. My dad and I had lived in this old house on the edge of the neighborhood for a few years. The area wasn't exactly the safest. Crime was pretty common, and we always had to be cautious. It wasn't uncommon to hear about break-ins or see suspicious people wandering around. Still, we had our routine, and as long as we stayed alert, we managed to keep things pretty quiet. The first time I heard the noise, it was just after sunset. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels while Dad was in the kitchen making something to eat. It was faint at first, just a soft thumping sound, like something moving around in the attic above. I figured it was a bird or maybe a squirrel. The house was old, and there were plenty of ways for critters to sneak in. I didn't think much of it at the time. A few days later, though, the noises became more frequent. I'd hear scratching, light tapping, or what sounded like something scurrying around up there late at night, just when I was about to fall asleep. It was annoying, but again, nothing that alarmed me. I mentioned it to my dad once, and he shrugged it off, saying he'd check for any loose boards or holes where animals could be getting in. But then, things started getting weird. One night, I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling. I'd been having trouble sleeping, partly because of those damn noises from the attic. This time, though, it was louder, more distinct. I remember lying there, listening intently, my heart starting to pound just a little. It wasn't the usual scratching or scurrying. It sounded heavier, like something bigger was up there, moving slowly across the floorboards. And then, I swear to God, I heard footsteps. Clear, unmistakable footsteps right above my head, slow and deliberate. I shot up in bed, holding my breath, listening. I thought for sure I was hearing things, maybe my mind playing tricks on me after weeks of sleepless nights. But the sound kept going, like someone was pacing back and forth directly over my room. The floor creaked, and I could even hear the slight shift of weight as they walked. My immediate thought was that someone had broken into the house and was hiding up there. We had heard stories about squatters taking over empty homes in the neighborhood, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be using our attic as a hideout. I was freaked out, but I didn't want to panic. Not yet. The next morning, I told my dad about the footsteps. He raised an eyebrow but didn't seem overly concerned. "Probably just the house settling," he said, his voice calm and steady. He was always the rational one, the skeptic. "Old houses like this creak all the time. I'll take a look up there this weekend." I nodded, but the unease didn't go away. That night, I asked one of my friends, Jake, to come over. I told him about the noises, and of course, he laughed it off, saying I was probably just being paranoid, but I could tell he was intrigued. He'd always been the type to get a thrill out of spooky stuff, so the idea of exploring a potentially haunted attic appealed to him in a weird way. We stayed up late, just hanging out and waiting for the noises to start again. It was around midnight when we heard it, a loud thud, like something heavy had been dropped directly above us. Jake's eyes widened, and he immediately turned toward the ceiling. "Dude, what the hell was that?" he whispered, his bravado fading quickly. I didn't say anything, just motioned for him to follow me. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and quietly made our way to the attic door at the end of the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The air felt colder the closer we got, and the floorboards creaked under our feet, every sound amplified in the dead silence of the house. When we reached the attic door, I hesitated. Something about the air up there felt wrong, like it was heavier, pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. I glanced at Jake, who nodded for me to go ahead. I took a deep breath, reached for the door handle, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open with a long, agonizing groan. We both froze for a second, listening for any signs of movement from above, but the attic was deathly silent now. Jake went up first, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he climbed the narrow wooden stairs. I followed close behind, every muscle in my body tense. As soon as I stepped into the attic, the cold hit me like a wall. The air was frigid, much colder than the rest of the house, and it smelled musty, like old wood and dust. The attic was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and random junk my dad had stored up there over the years, but nothing seemed out of place. We moved slowly, sweeping our flashlights over every corner, every shadow. I could feel the tension building in my chest, the weight of the silence pressing down on us. And then, just when I started to think maybe it was all in my head, we heard it, a scraping sound. Coming from the far corner of the attic, near the floor, like something or someone was clawing at the wood. Jake whipped his flashlight toward the sound, and we both froze, staring at the dark corner. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, and I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. It wasn't an animal. It couldn't be. The sound was too deliberate, too human. "Let's get the hell out of here," Jake muttered, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. We both bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind us. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could barely catch my breath. We ran into the living room, where we collapsed onto the couch, both of us wide-eyed and shaken. "I told you something was up there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his hands trembling. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. "We need to call the cops." I hesitated. I didn't want to seem like we were overreacting, but after what we'd just heard, I knew something wasn't right. So, we did it. We called the police. When they arrived, I explained everything. The noises, the footsteps, the scratching. They took it seriously enough, given the neighborhood, and sent a couple of officers to check the attic. They were up there for about 10 minutes, shining their flashlights around and poking through the boxes. But when they came back down, they told us they didn't find anything. No signs of a break-in, no evidence that anyone had been up there at all. "It's probably just rats," one of the officers said, shrugging it off. "Old houses like this attract them." I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. Rats don't make footsteps. Rats don't scratch at doors like they're trying to get in. After the cops left, Jake and I sat in silence for a long time. Neither of us knew what to say. But just as he was getting ready to leave, there was a knock at the door. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. She was an older woman, lived alone in the house next door. She looked a little shaken, which wasn't like her. She was usually pretty tough. She pulled me aside and whispered, "I didn't want to say anything while the police were here, but I saw something earlier." My stomach dropped. "What did you see?" "I was in my backyard, putting away some laundry, and I saw two people jumping over your fence into your backyard. It was dark, so I couldn't see their faces, but they were moving fast, like they didn't want to be seen." I felt the blood drain from my face. "When was this?" "Just before the police showed up," she said, her voice low. I thought it was odd, but I didn't want to bother anyone. I thanked her, trying to keep my voice steady, but my mind was racing. If she was telling the truth, then someone had been in our attic. and they'd gotten out before the police arrived. Jake left soon after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For the next few nights, I barely slept, always on edge, waiting for the footsteps to start again. But they didn't. The house went quiet. Too quiet. I never heard the noises from the attic after that night, but I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Someone or something had been living up there, watching us, listening. It started out simple enough. I had this habit of going on these long solo hikes to clear my head, especially after a stressful week. I'd always been pretty good with directions, and I liked getting off the beaten path. This time, I'd chosen a trail in a remote section of the national forest, a place not many people knew about, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and my thoughts. The first few hours were perfect. The autumn air was cool, the leaves crunching beneath my boots with every step, and the sunlight filtering through the trees gave everything this warm golden glow. It felt like I was walking through one of those nature documentaries where everything seems untouched, perfectly preserved. But after a while, the trail started to fade, becoming less clear, more overgrown. I figured it would loop back around eventually, so I kept going, hoping to find a clearing or at least some kind of marker. That's when I first noticed it. At first, it was just a feeling, an uncomfortable prickling at the back of my neck, like someone was standing right behind me. I stopped, turned around, but there was nothing. Just trees. Tall, silent, indifferent trees. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, it was easy to get paranoid when you're out there by yourself. Your mind starts to fill in the gaps when it's too quiet. But as I kept walking, that feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. Every few minutes I'd stop, glance over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping. Not far off, maybe 20-30 feet behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind rustling through the branches. But then, there it was again. A soft, deliberate crack of a branch, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving in the underbrush. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or some other hiker out for a walk. But the longer I stood there, straining to hear any more sounds, the more my mind started to race. What if it wasn't a deer? What if it wasn't another hiker? The thought made my stomach twist. I kept walking, trying to pick up my pace, but the trail had become more difficult. Narrower, rockier. My foot slipped once, but I caught myself before I fell. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the sweat starting to trickle down the back of my neck, despite the cool air. I just needed to get back to a more recognizable part of the trail. I wasn't lost yet, but I was getting there. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow between the trees, barely noticeable. I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, the way the sun was filtering through the branches. But as I kept walking, I saw him again, closer this time. A man, standing still, half hidden behind a tree, just watching. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, we just stared at each other, me frozen in place, him standing there like a statue. He was too far away to make out his face, but I could see he was tall, wearing a dark jacket, maybe a backpack. But what really unnerved me was the way he was standing. Not like a hiker, not someone just taking a break on the trail. He was too still, too rigid, like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, so I did. I picked up my pace, forcing myself not to run, not to look back. Just keep walking, I told myself. You're being paranoid. He's probably just some guy out for a hike, same as you. But then I heard it again. The sound of footsteps behind me, slow, measured. He was following me. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was hammering in my chest. Every step I took, I could hear him matching my pace, keeping just far enough behind that I couldn't see him, but close enough that I knew he was there. And then it happened. My foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel, and before I could catch myself, I went down hard. Pain shot through my ankle as I landed on my side, the wind knocked out of me. I tried to get up, but the second I put weight on my foot, agony ripped through my leg. I'd twisted my ankle, badly. My whole lower leg throbbed, and I knew, without a doubt, I wasn't going to be walking out of there. I looked up, scanning the trees for any sign of the man. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of the wind. But then I saw him, standing at the edge of the clearing, closer this time. He hadn't moved, just stood there, staring at me from the shadows. Panic surged through me. I scrambled backward, dragging myself across the ground, trying to put some distance between us. My ankle screamed in protest, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to get out of there. The man didn't move. He just stood there watching me struggle. I called out, my voice shaky and hoarse. "Hey, what do you want?" No answer. He didn't take a step toward me, didn't even flinch. He just kept staring. My throat tightened, fear constricting my chest like a vice. I tried to think rationally, to tell myself that maybe he wasn't dangerous, maybe he was just as scared as I was. But something about the way he was standing, the way he was watching, it wasn't right. Then, without warning, he took a step forward. My heart leapt into my throat. I scrambled to my feet, putting as much weight on my good leg as I could, and hobbled forward, half limping, half running. The pain was unbearable, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I could hear him now, his footsteps crunching on the forest floor, faster, more deliberate. He was getting closer. I didn't know where I was going. There was no clear path in front of me, just trees and underbrush. My only thought was to keep moving, to put as much distance between us as possible. I forced my way through the thicket, branches scratching at my arms and face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a small embankment, landing hard on my side. The wind knocked out of me again. Pain shot through my ankle, sharp and intense. I couldn't move. I lay there, gasping for breath, my vision swimming as I tried to gather my bearings. And then I saw him, standing at the top of the embankment, his dark figure silhouetted against the sky. He wasn't far now, maybe 20 feet away. Too close. Much too close. For a moment we just stared at each other again, the same eerie silence between us. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching, his face still hidden in the shadows. I tried to crawl backward, but my body wouldn't respond. The pain in my ankle had become unbearable, and every movement sent waves of agony through my leg. I was trapped. The man took another step forward, and then another. He was moving slowly, deliberately, like he knew there was no rush, like he knew I wasn't going anywhere. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, watching him come closer. Seconds felt like hours. But then, just as he reached the bottom of the embankment, something changed. He stopped, his head tilting slightly, as if he was listening for something. And then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I lay there, stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened. One moment, he had been right there, so close I could feel the weight of his presence. And the next, he was gone, swallowed by the forest. I didn't move for a long time after that. I couldn't. My body refused to cooperate, locked in place by the lingering terror. It wasn't until the sun started to set, casting long shadows over the forest, that I finally found the strength to move. I managed to crawl back to the trail, dragging myself inch by inch until I found a way out. It took hours, and every second felt like an eternity. But somehow, I made it. When I finally reached the ranger station, they looked at me like I was crazy. I told them everything, about the man, about how he had followed me, how he had been watching. They sent out a search party, but they didn't find anything. No sign of him. No tracks. No trace. It was like he had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. I know he was real. And I know he's still out there, watching. I'm not really sure why I'm telling you this. Maybe it's because it's been stuck in my head for months now, and no matter how much I try to forget about it, I just can't. Something like this, it doesn't go away easily. And the more I think about it, the more it feels like I missed something. Like there's a piece of the puzzle that I didn't see at the time, but that's nagging at me now. It was last fall, late October, when I decided to go on a solo hike through the mountains. I've always loved hiking, especially when I can get away from everything. No phone, no internet, just me and nature. There's something about the isolation that feels peaceful. So I planned this trip to a trail I'd heard about, one that would take me up to a secluded peak with an incredible view of the valley below. It wasn't the most popular trail, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was uneventful. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp air with just enough sunshine to keep me comfortable. I set up camp halfway up the trail and settled in for the night, enjoying the sounds of the forest around me. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the crackling of my small campfire. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But the next morning, as I was packing up my gear and getting ready to start the next leg of the hike, I ran into someone. It's not uncommon to see other hikers on the trail, but this guy seemed a bit out of place. He was standing by the edge of a small clearing, just watching the mountains in the distance. His tent was set up not far from mine, though I hadn't noticed him the night before. He was older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, with a grizzled beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen a lot more than he let on. He had a kind face, though, and when he saw me, he smiled and waved. "Heading up to the peak?" he asked as I approached. His voice was deep but friendly, the kind that puts you at ease. "Yeah, that's the plan," I said, returning the smile. "What about you?" He nodded. "Same here. Thought I'd spend a couple of nights at the top, take in the view, you know?" We chatted for a bit, just the usual small talk about the trail, the weather, and what brought us both out here. He told me he'd been coming to this mountain for years, ever since he was young, and that it was his favorite place to get away from the world. "There's something special about this place," he said, looking off into the distance. "Something peaceful." I agreed. There was something special about it. Something that made you feel like the rest of the world was a million miles away. After a few minutes, we wished each other luck, and I continued on my way up the trail. I didn't think much of the encounter, just another hiker enjoying the solitude like me. I figured I'd see him again once we both reached the summit. It took me another half day to make it to the peak. When I finally got there, it was even more stunning than I had imagined. The view stretched out for miles, the valley below painted in shades of orange and red from the autumn leaves. I set up my tent in a small clearing just below the summit, planning to stay for 2 nights before heading back down. I thought about the man I'd met earlier, wondering when he'd arrive. His pace seemed slower than mine, but I figured he'd show up eventually. But as the sun dipped lower and the sky turned a deep purple, he still hadn't appeared. I didn't worry at first. Maybe he had decided to stop somewhere along the trail for the night. Maybe he had changed his mind about camping at the peak. The first night at the summit was uneventful. It was colder up there, and the wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't anything unusual for this time of year. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and drifted off, expecting to see the man the next day. But he didn't show up the next day either. By late afternoon, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It wasn't like he had a strict schedule or anything, but something about it didn't sit right with me. He'd seemed so sure about reaching the summit, about spending a couple of nights there, and yet there was no sign of him. I considered heading back down early, maybe even trying to find him along the trail, but something held me back. I convinced myself that he was fine, that he'd probably decided to camp somewhere else. Still, the feeling lingered, a gnawing worry that I couldn't shake. That night, as I lay in my tent, the wind picked up even more, rattling the fabric and making it difficult to sleep. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, rustling leaves, the kind of sounds that make you second guess whether it's just the wind or something else entirely. At one point, I swear I heard footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking just beyond the edge of my camp. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening. But the sound faded after a few moments, and when I unzipped the tent to check, there was nothing. Just the darkness and the wind. The next morning, I decided to pack up and head back down the mountain. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and I didn't want to push my luck by staying any longer. The hike down was uneventful at first, the same peaceful trail that had brought me up. But when I reached the spot where I had met the man, I froze. His tent was still there, pitched exactly as it had been the day before. But there was no sign of him. The camp looked untouched. The fire pit was cold, the gear neatly arranged. It was like he had just vanished. I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "Hello? Are you there?" No answer, just the wind and the distant sound of birds. I walked closer to the tent, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The zipper was partially open, but when I looked inside, there was nothing, just an empty sleeping bag and a few personal items. A flashlight, a book, some food. It was as if he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. A chill ran down my spine. Where had he gone? I thought about looking for him, but something held me back. Maybe it was the eerie stillness of the camp, the way everything seemed too perfect, too undisturbed. Maybe it was the nagging thought that I was intruding on something I didn't fully understand. That's when I saw it. A light. A faint, flickering beam of light coming from deep in the woods. At first, I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone else on the trail. But the more I watched, the more I realized something was off. The light wasn't moving. It wasn't bobbing up and down like a person walking. It was just there, hovering in the distance, as if someone was standing perfectly still, holding the flashlight in place. My first instinct was to go toward it, to see if it was the man, if he needed help. But as I took a step forward, something stopped me. A feeling, a deep, overwhelming sense of dread, like my body was screaming at me not to go any closer. I watched the light for what felt like hours, my heart racing, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then slowly, the light began to fade, sinking deeper into the trees until it was swallowed by the darkness. I didn't go after it. I couldn't. Something about the way it moved, the way it just disappeared without a sound, it wasn't right. It didn't feel human. I hurried back to my camp, packed up the last of my gear, and started back down the trail as fast as I could. The whole way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made my heart pound in my chest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that light again, or worse, the figure holding it. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I got into my car and drove straight to the nearest ranger station. I didn't know what else to do. I told them everything. The man I'd met, his empty camp, the strange light in the woods. They listened politely, but I could tell they didn't quite believe me. Still, they said they'd send someone up to check it out. A week later, I got a call from one of the rangers. They'd searched the area, but there was no sign of the man. His tent and belongings were still there, just as I had described, but he was gone. No tracks, no evidence that he'd even left the camp. Just gone. They told me it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Hikers go missing all the time in those mountains, they said. Most of the time they're found, injured, lost, but alive. But sometimes they're never found at all. Even after I got that call from the rangers, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whole thing was nagging at me in a way I couldn't shake. What had happened to that man? I kept running it over and over in my head, trying to figure out if I'd missed something. Had he wandered off in the middle of the night and fallen somewhere? Maybe gotten disoriented? But that didn't explain the eerie stillness of his camp, the way everything had been left so perfectly, like he just stepped out for a second and never came back. And that light just hanging there in the trees, not moving, not fading, until it was swallowed by the dark. I hadn't seen anyone, just the beam. It felt like something was luring me, and I was glad I hadn't followed it, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. It was like a part of me knew, really knew, that if I had taken one more step toward that light, I wouldn't be here telling you this story. For weeks, I tried to let it go. I'd lie awake at night, my mind racing, replaying every detail, trying to make sense of it. Sometimes I'd dream about the man, his face slowly fading into the darkness until he was just gone. And then I'd wake up, heart pounding, feeling like something was watching me in my own home. I thought I was being paranoid, just shaken up by the whole thing. But one night, about a month after my hike, I was sitting in my living room, just zoning out in front of the TV. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was quiet. That's when I heard it, a soft sound, like a faint scratching coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the side of the house. I tried to ignore it, but then it came again, closer this time, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate. I got up, slowly, and went to the window. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was nothing. Just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But when I looked out into the yard, I didn't see anything, just darkness, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The street lamp at the corner barely lit up the edge of my yard. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow, like a flicker of light far off in the distance. I thought maybe it was a reflection, or someone walking with a flashlight on the next block over. But as I stared, the light grew stronger, brighter, until I realized it wasn't in the distance. It was right at the edge of my yard, just beyond the reach of the street lamp. It was the same light. I froze. My mouth went dry, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. It was the same cold, flickering beam I'd seen in the woods, standing perfectly still. And this time, it was closer. I couldn't move. I stood there, my hands gripping the windowsill, staring at that light. My brain was screaming at me to do something. Close the curtains, run, call someone, but I couldn't. I just stood there, watching, waiting for something to happen. And then, just like before, the light began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it drifted backward, fading into the trees. But this time, I saw something else. Something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure, barely visible in the dim glow. Tall, thin, standing completely still, just like it had in the woods. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. And as the light faded, the figure disappeared with it, swallowed by the night. I slammed the curtains shut, my hands shaking. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was it real? Had I imagined the whole thing? But deep down, I knew I hadn't. It was real. Whatever had happened in those mountains, it had followed me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak, every whisper of wind sent me into a panic, thinking that light would come back, that it would be standing right outside my window, waiting. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe someone had been out there walking with a flashlight. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. My house wasn't near any hiking trails. There was no reason for anyone to be wandering around in the middle of the night like that. I decided to do something about it. I didn't know what, but I couldn't just sit there, waiting for that light to come back. So, I called the ranger station again, hoping they might have an update on the missing man. Maybe, just maybe, there was some connection. When I spoke to the ranger, he sounded hesitant, like he didn't really want to talk about it. But eventually, he told me something that chilled me to my core. The search didn't turn up anything, he said, his voice low. No tracks, no sign of the man. But here's the strange part. We found his camp exactly how you described it, perfectly intact, except for one thing. I waited, my heart pounding in my ears. What? There was a flashlight, still on. The batteries were almost drained, but it was standing upright, like someone had placed it there intentionally. But there were no footprints, no sign of him anywhere. I hung up the phone, my mind reeling. The light, it was his. It had to be. But if that was true, then where was he? How could his flashlight still be on, weeks after he disappeared? And then it hit me, the figure. The one I'd seen in the woods, and again in my yard. What if it wasn't just some random person? What if it was him? What if he hadn't disappeared at all, but had become something else? Something that still lingered in those woods, and now in my life. The thought terrified me, but it also made a horrible kind of sense. Whatever had happened to that man, whatever had taken him, it wasn't finished, and now it was watching me. I haven't seen the light again since that night, but I can feel it. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I get this feeling like I'm being watched, like something is just out of sight, waiting. I try to ignore it, but it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I don't know what it wants, or why it chose me, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to those mountains again. And if you ever see a light in the woods, just standing there, perfectly still, don't follow it. Don't even look at it, because once you do, it'll never leave you alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend hike, a way to disconnect from work and everything else. I had found this remote trail online, one that promised seclusion and some of the best views of the mountains. What I didn't realize was just how remote it really was. By the time I realized my phone had lost signal, it was too late to turn back. But that didn't bother me. I actually liked the idea of being completely off the grid for a while. It was late afternoon when I came across it, a small, weather-beaten house at the edge of a dense forest. It was unexpected, especially since I hadn't seen any other signs of civilization for miles. I figured maybe it was a ranger's cabin or a place used by the Forest Service, but something about it seemed off. The shutters were half falling off, the paint was peeling, and there was this eerie stillness surrounding it, like even the birds didn't dare come too close. My feet were sore, and the light was starting to fade, so I thought it might be a good idea to see if I could get directions or maybe even a glass of water. As I approached, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, it had been hours since I'd seen another person. But that didn't explain the chill that crept down my spine as I knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing happened. I was about to turn and leave when I heard shuffling inside, followed by the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened just a crack, revealing a man. He looked old, but not in the way you'd expect. His face had deep lines, his eyes sunken like someone who hadn't slept in days, but there was something else, something unsettling. His clothes were a little too clean for someone living out here, and his eyes seemed to flicker with something I couldn't quite place, something predatory. "Lost?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Not exactly," I said, forcing a smile. "I was just wondering if you could point me back to the main trail. I think I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere." For a moment he didn't respond, just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Then, without a word, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come inside, I'll show you." I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave, but the sun was sinking behind the mountains, and I didn't fancy wandering around in the dark with no sense of direction. So, against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior was as run down as the outside, but it was the air that struck me first, thick, stale, and cold, like the windows hadn't been opened in years. The place was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb that flickered every few seconds, casting long shadows on the walls. A tattered map of the region was spread out on the table in the center of the room, the edges curling and yellowed with age. The man took the seat opposite me, leaning over the map. His fingers traced the lines like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "This," he muttered, pointing to an area I didn't recognize, "is where you are." I leaned in closer, squinting at the faded ink. "I don't think." He cut me off. "You'll need to go this way." His finger slid along a path that wasn't marked on any map I'd seen before. "It'll take you back. You'll be fine." I looked at him and then back at the map. None of it made sense. This path, it didn't lead anywhere near where I had planned to go. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Are you sure? That seems a little..." He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back with a loud scrape. "I said you'll be fine." There was something final in his tone, something that made my heart race. I stood too, ready to make my excuses and leave, but as I turned toward the door, pain shot through my ankle. I looked down in disbelief. I must have twisted it somehow, maybe on the uneven floor. The pain was sharp, and when I tried to put weight on it, I nearly collapsed. The man was watching me, his expression unreadable. "You hurt yourself?" I nodded, biting back the panic rising in my chest. "It's nothing. I'll just..." "You should stay," he interrupted, his voice too calm. "At least until morning." I stared at him, trying to gauge his intent, but his face remained blank. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out, but the throbbing in my ankle made it clear that walking wasn't an option. I had no choice. He gestured to a small couch in the corner of the room. "You can rest there." The couch was old and smelled faintly of mildew, but I limped over and sat down, wincing at the pain. The man disappeared into another room, leaving me alone in the flickering light. I sat there, listening to the wind howling outside, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The man didn't come back. The light from the bulb overhead flickered more violently, casting jagged shadows across the walls. I thought about leaving, about just dragging myself out the door and into the night, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Fear, maybe. Or something worse, something I couldn't explain. Just as I was about to force myself up, I heard a noise from the other room, a low, guttural sound, like something being dragged. My heart leaped into my throat. The man still hadn't come back. What was he doing? The door to the back room creaked open, and I froze. But instead of the man, a shadowy figure emerged, something much larger than I'd expected. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just the poor lighting, maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure seemed to shift. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, and I could hear that dragging noise again, like something heavy being pulled along the floor. It stepped into the light, and that's when I saw it. Ragged clothes hanging off a body that didn't seem quite human. Its face twisted, distorted, like a mask of skin stretched too tight. I scrambled off the couch, my ankles screaming in protest, and stumbled toward the door. The figure let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that chilled me to the bone. It didn't chase me. It didn't have to. The moment I reached the door, I realized it was locked. Frantically, I fumbled with the lock, my hands trembling. Behind me, the figure moved closer, its breath hot on the back of my neck. Finally, the lock clicked, and I threw open the door, tumbling out into the freezing night air. I ran, or hobbled really, down the path as fast as my injured ankle would allow, not daring to look back. The wind whipped through the trees, and the forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness suffocating. Every sound, every rustle of leaves felt like it was following me, chasing me deeper into the night. After what felt like hours, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, my ankle throbbing. I glanced behind me, expecting to see that thing looming in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the silence of the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The cold seeped into my bones, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted face, heard that horrible laugh. By morning, the sun had barely risen, but I forced myself to stand and start walking again. Eventually, I stumbled across another trail, one that led back to civilization. When I finally made it to a small ranger station, I told them everything. They listened, nodding politely, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They said there hadn't been anyone living in that house for years. It had been abandoned after the old owner disappeared under strange circumstances. I left that station, limping, exhausted, and with a heavy weight in my chest. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is I'll never go back to those woods again. Even after leaving the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly safe yet. The whole drive home, every flicker of shadow from passing trees or distant headlights made my heart jump. My mind kept replaying the moment I'd locked eyes with that thing, whatever it was. The way it looked at me, it wasn't like an animal. It wasn't just hunger or instinct. There was something calculating behind those eyes, something deeply wrong. Back at home, I tried to return to normal life. I tried to convince myself that it was just exhaustion from the hike, that maybe I'd hit my head or hallucinated everything. But no matter how many times I told myself that, the memory of that house, the old man's twisted grin, and the creeping horror wouldn't leave me. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere I went, just out of sight. A few nights after getting back, I had the first nightmare. I was back in the forest, limping through the trees, only this time I could hear footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer. When I turned around, it wasn't the old man chasing me. It was the figure from the house, its distorted face grinning at me, those sunken eyes never blinking. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I tried to avoid thinking about it, but the nightmares kept coming, each one worse than the last. In every dream, I was back in that house. Only this time, I never made it out. Sometimes it would start with me sitting at that same table, staring at the map, as the old man watched me with that unnerving smile. Other times, I'd be trying to escape, my injured ankle slowing me down as something from the shadows chased me. But the worst part, the part that really made me question my sanity, wasn't the dreams. It was what started happening when I was awake. I began to notice things. Small things at first. Shadows moving in the corner of my eye only to vanish when I turned to look. Unfamiliar noises in the house late at night. Footsteps, a creaking floorboard, a door softly closing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The final straw came about 2 weeks after I got back. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself by watching TV. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the room. The TV flickered as I scrolled through channels aimlessly, not really paying attention. And then, in the reflection of the screen, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no. There, standing in the hallway behind me, was a figure. The same twisted, too long limbs, the same hunched posture. My blood turned to ice. It was watching me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell off the couch. But when I turned to look, nothing. The hallway was empty. But I knew I had seen it. I had felt its presence. That night, I packed a bag. I didn't care where I went. I just couldn't stay in that house. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, thinking maybe I just needed some space, that maybe getting away from home would help me calm down. But the feeling didn't leave. If anything, it got worse. Even at the motel, I could feel it, like something was watching me, waiting just out of sight. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that presence growing closer, the same creeping dread from the forest. By morning, I was exhausted, barely able to think straight. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep running. I needed answers. I spent the next day searching online for any information I could find about the area where I'd been hiking, about that house. There wasn't much. Most of the articles were old, dusty records of the land, mentions of old settlers and forgotten trails. But there was one story, a short newspaper clipping from over 50 years ago, that caught my eye. It was about a man who had gone missing. His name wasn't mentioned, just vague references to him being a recluse, living in a small house deep in the woods. The article didn't give many details, but it mentioned something strange. It said that before he disappeared, several hikers had reported seeing odd lights near the house, hearing strange noises, and this part chilled me, talking to a man who didn't seem entirely right. One hiker had claimed the man asked him for directions, even though he lived in those woods his whole life. Another said the man's face looked like it was stretching. My heart was pounding as I read, my palms sweating. I knew this was the same man, the one I had met, or at least, something like him. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he's still out there, or if what I saw was just a remnant of something long dead, something that never left those woods. But whatever it was, it had followed me, and now it wanted something. The next few days were a blur. I tried everything, talking to the rangers again, even visiting the town's local historian. But no one had answers, and the more I searched, the more I felt like I was losing myself, like I was being pulled back toward that house. That's when I realized the truth. It wasn't over, not for me. One night, as I sat in the dim light of my motel room, I finally understood. It had marked me somehow. I had stepped into its world, and now, no matter where I went, it would find me. I could hear the dragging sound again, faint at first, but growing louder. That same low laugh echoed in my head. I don't know how long I can keep running. I don't know how long before it catches up with me. But if you ever find yourself out there, in those woods, if you see that house, don't go inside. And if you do, for God's sake, don't look at the map. Because once you see the path it shows you, you might never come back. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure why I'm even telling this story. Part of me thinks that putting it into words makes it all too real, something I've been trying to forget. But it's been eating away at me ever since it happened, and I can't shake the feeling that I need to get it off my chest. You know how some things, even when they're over, never really let go? This is one of those things. It all started when I decided to go camping alone. Not because I had to, but because I wanted a break. Life had been stressful, work, relationships, all of it. I just needed to unplug for a bit, to get away from people and clear my head. I found this little place online, a small, isolated lake in the middle of nowhere, perfect for a few days of solitude. It wasn't a big, popular campground. It was more of a local spot. Hidden, quiet, the kind of place where you could hear the wind through the trees and see the stars without the glow of city lights. The first couple of days were exactly what I'd hoped for. The lake was small, almost perfectly round, surrounded by thick trees that cast long shadows over the water when the sun dipped low in the sky. There was a soft breeze, the kind that made the leaves rustle just enough to be calming, not unsettling. At night, the water would reflect the stars so perfectly that it almost felt like the sky had doubled in size. It was peaceful, more peaceful than I had felt in a long time. It was on the third day that I met William. I was sitting by the lake, just after breakfast, when I heard footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I looked up and saw him approaching from the direction of the trail. He looked friendly enough, maybe in his late 40s, with a thick head of graying hair and a weathered face, the kind of face that told you he'd spent a lot of time outdoors. He wore an old flannel shirt and jeans, carrying a small backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mind if I join you?" he asked with a smile. I wasn't expecting to run into anyone out here. The place was so remote I'd figured I was the only one around, but I wasn't exactly opposed to some company after a couple of days alone. Besides, he seemed harmless enough, so I nodded and gestured for him to sit. We started talking, just small stuff at first. He told me he came out to this area often, liked to hike and fish when the weather was nice. I told him about why I was out here, how I needed some time away from the grind. It was casual, easy conversation, and I felt myself relaxing a bit more as we talked. Over the next couple of days, we bumped into each other a few more times. He'd always just seemed to appear, either on the trail or near my campsite, never too intrusive, but always friendly. We shared a few meals, and he even brought over some fresh fish he'd caught one morning. He told stories, mostly about the area, its history, things like that. The kind of stuff you'd expect from a seasoned outdoorsman. But looking back, there was something odd about the way he always just showed up. At first I thought it was coincidence, but it was like he knew where I'd be without asking. The lake was big enough that I figured we wouldn't cross paths that often, but he always seemed to find me. Then came the afternoon when he suggested we check out a scenic spot he knew about, something off the beaten path. It wasn't part of the marked trails, he said, but he promised it was worth the walk. I hesitated. Something about the way he suggested it felt different, a little off. He'd been so casual and laid back until that point, but when he talked about this spot, his tone changed. It was almost eager, like he was too excited for me to see it. I could feel a slight tug of anxiety in my gut, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Too much time alone in the woods can do that to you. So I agreed. The trail started out easy enough. William led the way, walking confidently through the trees while I followed a few steps behind. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, the path started to get narrower, the trees thicker. The sunlight, which had been filtering down through the leaves, was now barely reaching us, casting long, creeping shadows over the forest floor. I started feeling uneasy again. The air seemed different here, heavier, colder, even though it wasn't that late in the day. I tried to shake off the feeling, but something in me kept screaming that this wasn't right. "Are we almost there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a little further," William said, but there was no warmth in his voice this time. It was flat, mechanical. Something had shifted. His whole demeanor had changed. Gone was the friendly, easygoing guy I'd met by the lake. Now he was focused, distant, like he had one thing on his mind and nothing else. After what felt like forever, we came to a small clearing. In the center of it was an old rusted RV. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned and forgotten, with weeds growing up around the tires and windows caked in grime. I stopped in my tracks, my skin crawling. "Here we are," William said, turning to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. I don't know what it was, but something about the way he looked at me in that moment made my heart drop. His face had changed. It was colder, harder, like the friendly mask he'd been wearing had slipped away. I could feel my pulse quickening, and every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to get the hell out of there. Before I could say anything, the door of the RV creaked open. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw him. A man, wild-eyed and gaunt, stumbling out of the RV. He was filthy, his clothes tattered, and his face was twisted into a grotesque grin. "Got another one, William?" the man rasped, his voice thick with something dark, something I couldn't place. My breath caught in my throat. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. but I was frozen in place, my mind racing to catch up with what was happening. This wasn't right. None of this was right. William didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. The other man took a step closer, his eyes locked onto me like a predator sizing up its prey. That's when something inside me snapped. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from that place, away from William and the man from the RV. Branches whipped against my face, tearing at my clothes as I ran, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I could hear them behind me, footsteps, voices, shouting, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, pushing through the forest until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. I don't know how long I ran before I finally stumbled back onto the main trail. It felt like hours, though it could have been only minutes. My campsite was just ahead, and I rushed toward it, desperate to grab my things and get the hell out of there. But when I reached the clearing, everything was gone. My tent, my backpack, my gear, all of it had vanished. It was as if I'd never been there at all. The fire pit I'd built was nothing but cold ashes, and the spot where my tent had been was bare, like no one had ever camped there. My heart sank, and for a moment I thought I was going crazy. Had I imagined everything? Was any of this real? But the terror still clung to me. The memory of William's cold stare and the man from the RV burned into my mind. I knew it had happened. I just didn't understand how. Shaking, I grabbed my phone from my pocket. Thankfully, I still had that, and dialed 911. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped it. When the police arrived, I told them everything. Every detail, every feeling. I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I just needed someone to believe me. They searched the area, but they didn't find anything. No RV, no signs of William or the other man, no trace that anyone had been there at all. They found my story hard to believe, but I could see it in their faces. Something about the way I told it made them uneasy. They said they'd keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they didn't expect to find anything. And maybe they won't. Maybe whatever it was, whatever they were, have already moved on. But I can't stop thinking about it. About how everything seemed fine, normal even, until it wasn't. How quickly things can change when you're out there, alone, with no one to call for help.